For 18 months, Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari radio was must-watch television, for all the wrong reasons. Tense silences. Passive-aggressive comebacks. A 7-time world champion asking his engineer, "Are you upset with me or something?" Live. On global broadcast. Not in a debrief. Not behind closed doors. On the feed that goes out to millions of people watching around the world. And the thing is, nobody was really surprised anymore. That was the worst part. The lowlights had become their own genre. People were clipping them, sharing them, waiting for the next one. The most decorated driver in the history of the sport, and his radio had become a punchline. Then, on a Sunday afternoon in Canada, something shifted. Hamilton swept past Verstappen with 6 laps to go, and when he climbed out of the car, he said 4 words that nobody had heard him say in red, really loving working with him. So what changed? Because the answer is more complicated, and far more interesting, than Ferrari simply swapping one engineer for another. To understand what happened in Montreal, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the decision Hamilton made when he left Mercedes, and what he was actually walking into. Hamilton left the most fluent driver-engineer partnership of his career to gamble on Ferrari in the final stretch of his time in the sport. He and Peter Bonington had built something over years at Mercedes, a shorthand, a rhythm, a way of communicating under pressure that became almost invisible because it worked so well. When Hamilton joined Ferrari, he knew he was giving that up. A new car he could learn. A new culture he could adapt to. Those things take time, but they are learnable. But talking to his engineer, that was supposed to be muscle memory. It wasn't. And you could hear it. Every single weekend, you could hear it. In Australia, his very first race in red, there were tense and clipped exchanges over a steering setting called K1. Hamilton saying, "Please," over and over, not as a courtesy, but like a man managing a conversation rather than having one. Like someone carefully choosing words so they don't make a difficult situation worse. That is not how a driver should sound when he is trying to go fast. In Miami, the line that went around the world. "Have a tea break while you're at it," fired off during a botched sequence of team orders, the frustration finally spilling past the point of containing it. That clip traveled far beyond the F1 audience. People who had never watched a race in their lives heard that line and understood immediately that something was wrong. And then Monaco. The one that stung most. Hamilton asking over the radio, "Are you upset with me or something?" And getting nothing back. Silence. On one of the most exposed broadcast feeds in the sport, in front of one of the biggest audiences of the year, at the most glamorous race on the calendar. That moment landed differently than the others. Because it wasn't frustration. It was vulnerability. A question that should never need to be asked between a driver and the person whose entire job is to help him. The pattern ran the whole season. Australia to Abu Dhabi. 24 races. A driver and an engineer who never clicked. But here is the detail that complicates the easy version of the story, and it is the part that actually matters for everything that comes next. Some of the sharpest analysts in the paddock argued, quietly and consistently throughout that season, that the frustration Hamilton was showing on the radio was never really about the man on the other end of it. It was aimed somewhere else entirely. At Ferrari's strategy department, a separate group, sitting in a different part of the operation, making the intra-race calls that Hamilton was actually reacting to. The race engineer, in that version of events, was simply the messenger. The voice delivering decisions he had no part in making. If that is true, then the problem was never personal. It was structural. And swapping one voice for another would not fix it. It would just change who reads out the bad decisions. That question, whether Ferrari fixed the right thing, is the one that every race from here is going to test. Keep it in your head. Ferrari did something about it quietly, the way they tend to do things. In January, the team announced that Hamilton's race engineer, the man who had been on the other end of all of those exchanges for a season and a half, was moving to a new position inside the organization. Running part of Ferrari's driver academy and its historic test program. A sideways step, framed neutrally in the kind of careful language that big teams use when they want to move someone without making it a story. The kind of personnel note that barely makes a ripple in the off-season noise, buried between chassis updates and sponsor announcements. But underneath that calm, carefully worded announcement was the real headline. Hamilton would start his second Ferrari season with a different voice in his ear. That voice belongs to Carlo Santi. And here is the part that got almost completely glossed over in the coverage that followed. Santi was not some junior engineer thrown in to fill a gap while the team figured out what to do. He is one of the most experienced people inside Ferrari. A man who has spent years on that pit wall. Who once ran the radio for a Ferrari world champion through a full season. Who served as that same champion's performance engineer before stepping up to the race engineer role. This is a heavyweight. Someone with a CV that most engineers in this paddock would spend a decade trying to build. But when he took over Hamilton's car, it was still widely understood, inside and outside the paddock, as a stopgap. An interim arrangement. A safe pair of hands to steady the ship while the team sorted out a longer-term plan. And the reason it was understood that way is because Ferrari had simultaneously done something else. Something that, when you look at it properly, tells you everything about how seriously the team was taking this problem. They went outside. At the same time Santi stepped onto Hamilton's radio, Ferrari brought in an outsider. Cedric Michel Grosjean, an engineer poached from a rival team, where he had spent years working trackside with one of the most exciting young talents on the grid. Ferrari did not promote from within. They did not shuffle existing staff. They identified someone at a competitor, decided he was the right person for the job, and went and got him. He was hired with a specific brief, become Lewis Hamilton's long-term race engineer. In that plan, Santi was the support act. Michel Grosjean was meant to be the headliner. And think carefully about what that move alone tells you. You do not poach a senior trackside engineer from one of your main title rivals to babysit a struggling project. You do not take on that disruption, the negotiations, the gardening leave, the competitive intelligence risk, unless you believe the investment is worth it. Ferrari was not patching a problem. They were building something around Hamilton. And they were willing to actively weaken a competitor to do it. So at this point Ferrari had built Hamilton a new pit wall with two engineers pointed at the same job, one holding the role now, one being groomed to take it over later. That is already an unusual arrangement. But there was a third piece. And this one, by most accounts, mattered to Hamilton more than either of the others. His performance engineer is a man named Luca Della. And Della is not new to Hamilton at all. He worked alongside Hamilton for years at Mercedes, on the power unit side, before making the decision to follow him into the Ferrari project. He joined the team early in the first Ferrari season, and by the back half of that year, around the Belgian Grand Prix, he had moved directly into Hamilton's race garage. Not on the periphery. Inside the operation, in the room where the decisions get made on a race weekend. He was a familiar face and a trusted voice. Someone who already knew how Hamilton thinks. What he feels through a car before he can articulate it in words. How he likes information delivered, when to give him detail, when to give him a number, when to say nothing. In a garage full of new relationships, new faces, new processes, Della was the one piece of continuity Hamilton had brought with him from his old life. The one person in that building who had been there before. Put it all together and you get an unusual machine. A current race engineer who was publicly framed as temporary. A future race engineer being carefully eased in from a rival team. And a performance engineer imported specifically from Mercedes because he already speaks the language. On paper, it should not obviously work. If anything, it reads like a setup that is just waiting to repeat the same crosswire problems all over again. Too many cooks, unclear lines of authority, a driver in the middle trying to figure out who to trust. Then Canada happened. Before Montreal, it is worth understanding where the season actually stood, because the story of Hamilton's second Ferrari season is not as simple as one bad year followed by one breakthrough weekend. It had already been swinging between extremes. He took a podium early in the year in China, a result that felt significant, a sign that the new setup might have real legs under it. But then came dips. Japan. Miami again. Weekends where he could not beat his teammate on the road, where the pace simply was not there, and where the old questions came creeping back. Was this working? Had anything actually changed? The season was not a straight line upward. It was a driver and a new pit wall still searching for consistency. Still trying to find the version of themselves that could perform together under pressure, week after week, not just on a good day. Which is exactly why what happened in Montreal mattered as much as it did. It was not the first good day. A driver like Hamilton has good days. What Canada was, what made it different, was the day everything finally lined up at the same time. He was quick from the start. He out-qualified Leclerc in qualifying for the sprint, then out-qualified him again for the Grand Prix itself. In the race, he stayed in the fight at the front, not just surviving there, but belonging there, and with 6 laps to go, he pulled off the move that defined the whole weekend. He dived past Verstappen into the first corner and refused to give the place back. Not a position inherited from a strategy call. Not a place gained in the pit lane. A genuine overtake on the fastest driver in the world, at a circuit where Verstappen is almost impossible to pass. He crossed the line second. His strongest finish since the day he joined Ferrari. His second podium of the year. And when he climbed out of the car, the thing that stood out was not the result itself. It was the way he talked about how he got there. Hamilton said he had gone his own way on setup that weekend. That he had sat with the data himself, worked through it with his engineer, and landed on a direction that felt right even when it diverged from what others around him were doing. That is a significant thing to say. It means the communication was good enough, detailed enough, honest enough, that he felt confident backing his own judgment. That he had the information he needed to make a call and trust it. And then he described that engineer in terms he had simply never used in red before. Absolutely awesome. Really loving working with him. For a driver whose radio had been a running headline for the wrong reasons across 2 seasons, that was a hard turn. Not a diplomatic answer in a press conference. A genuine, unprompted expression of something that had changed. He went further. He said he was elated. Proud of how hard the team had worked. And then, with what was described as a deep, audible sigh of relief, that he finally has the engineering team he has been working towards since he arrived at Ferrari. The same driver. The same red car. The same broadcast feeds that once carried silence and sarcasm and a champion asking if his engineer was upset with him. Now carrying warmth and relief and something that sounded, for the first time, like a partnership that actually works. That contrast is the whole story. Everything else is detail around it. But the detail matters. Because the arrangement that produced this result is the same unsettled arrangement it has been since January, and nobody has officially resolved it. Santi was the interim choice. Michel Grosjean was the intended long-term engineer. The plan was always that one was holding the seat warm for the other. So a genuinely fair question now hangs over all of this. If the temporary setup is the one delivering Hamilton's best Ferrari weekend, if the man who was supposed to be the support act is the one producing these results, what actually happens to the plan? Do you stick with what is working and quietly shelve the longer-term hire? Or do you go back to the original roadmap and risk dismantling the very thing that just started to click? Move too soon and you throw away momentum that took 18 months to build. Move too late and you have an expensive senior engineer sitting on the sidelines watching a so-called stopgap do the job he was brought in to do. There is no clean answer. Ferrari has not announced a permanent number 44 race engineer. What they have is a setup that is working, built, with some irony, on a man who was supposed to be keeping the seat warm. And then there is the bigger picture. The one that a perfect pit wall cannot fix on its own. No matter who is on Hamilton's radio, a great engineer does not add horsepower. Ferrari sits second in the constructors' standings, but second is a long way back from where the championship actually lives right now. Andrea Kimi Antonelli has been in a different category. 4 straight wins. A points lead that is starting to look like a cushion. Hamilton's best day in red, the weekend that finally clicked, the result that felt like a turning point, still ended with him watching the dominant car disappear up the road and cross the line ahead of him. Hamilton himself has been blunt about why. He has said it clearly and repeatedly. The engine. That is the ceiling. That is the thing holding the whole project back regardless of how well everything else is working. Which is what makes the next race the real test, and not just for the reasons people are focusing on. Monaco. Normally a late May fixture, it has been shifted later in the calendar this season as part of a logistics reshuffle. But the timing, as it turns out, could not be more pointed. It arrives at exactly the moment when the question of whether this new pit wall is genuinely real, or just a good weekend at the right circuit, needs an answer. Because Monaco is the one place on the calendar where raw engine power matters least. Where the gap that Ferrari's engine deficit creates on a normal Sunday effectively closes. Around the barriers of Monte Carlo, lap time comes from somewhere else entirely. From precision. From confidence. from trust between a driver and the people talking to him. A late call on those streets does not cost you a tenth. It costs you a position. Sometimes it costs you the race. In other words, if the new pit wall is the real thing, Monaco is where it should be most visible. The circuit essentially removes the variable that has been masking everything else and asks a clean question. When the engine gap is neutralized, how good is this combination? Hamilton arrives at that race second-guessing nothing about the voice in his ear. For the first time in his Ferrari career, that is genuinely true. A perfect partnership can turn a fifth-place car into a podium contender around those barriers. It cannot turn a Ferrari into the fastest car on the grid. Both of those things are true at the same time, and they pull in different directions. The pit wall story and the engine story are running in parallel, and Monaco is the weekend that lets you see each of them clearly, without the other one getting in the way. For 18 months, the story of Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari was something you could hear going wrong over the radio. The silences. The sarcasm. The questions that should never have needed asking. Now the radio has gone quiet, for the right reasons. And next week, on the one circuit built to prove whether a partnership is the real thing or just a good run of form, the next chapter gets written. Subscribe, and we will be there for the Monaco answer.